I hope after you have heard these presentations, you will conclude that the advisory board made excellent choices. Our keynoters this year are Robert Putnam, a renowned Harvard University political science professor, and his co-author, Sherilyn Garrett, who is an Harvard alum and herself a highly respected author. And I wish to thank the Center's advisory board for its work in choosing the theme for the competition and hence for this conference. I want to thank them for their wisdom in selecting the fellowship recipients and for choosing the keynoters. I want to especially thank Professor Alisa Moldavanova, who suggested the keynoters, contacted them, and was instrumental in getting them to agree to keynote this conference. I thank her as well for her hard work in helping me and my staff organize and publicize the conference, and for taking the major task of moderating this entire conference. Professor Moldavanova is a very engaged and vigorous member of the Center's advisory board. Additionally, I want to thank the Center's administrative assistant, Tiffin Carter, who as usual is working quietly and efficiently behind the scenes, but without whose work this conference and much of what the Center does would not be possible. My final task as I open this conference is to thank the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences for agreeing to send a representative in the person of Associate Dean Heather Dilloway to give welcoming remarks at this conference. The class deans have always been willing to use their time and wisdom to open our conferences. And the Center is ever grateful to have the prestige of the Dean's Office associated with the conference. And Heather Dilloway has been a very good friend of the Center for many years as a sociology professor, as a department chair, and now as Associate Dean. So I will now yield the floor to Associate Dean Heather Dilloway for her welcoming remarks, and then she will yield the helm to the moderator, Professor Moldavanova, who will be in charge of the proceedings for the rest of the conference. So I thank you all for coming to this opening session and hope that you will stay for the entire conference. And so I call now on Associate Dean Heather Dilloway. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Happy spring. And I'm not the only representative of the Dean's office here. Claudio Verani is just as much of a representative as I am. So I wanted to acknowledge that and say that we are both very happy to be here, even though the Dean cannot. And I'm happy to give this welcome on behalf of the Dean. Claudio and I both know, and the Dean knows as well, how important the Humanities Center is to Wayne State and to all of the faculty here. It's one of the only spaces that we have where we can have interdisciplinary dialogues, debates, lots of different conversations, and spur on scholarship that really does cross disciplinary lines. And this safe space is really important in that regard. And I think it is and has always been a special home for a lot of us that energizes us, make sure we keep engaging in new projects, make sure we keep engaging with colleagues. And I think that's especially important now that we're in the middle, or hopefully maybe past the middle of a pandemic. This kind of interaction is so important, just so that we can keep doing our best work. So this conference is one of the fixtures of the Humanities Center. These annual conferences really are a unique thing that we should all treasure. One of the things that I love the most about recent Humanities Center conferences is that everyone is around a particular concept or phrase or way of thinking. Everything from democracy to mobilities to survival to I think borders, intersections, revolution, design. And now failure. There are such neat dialogues and debates around these concepts, and we can't get that anywhere else at the university right now. So this is a really important forum for that. In terms of the future of failure, we definitely hear that word a lot these days. And in fact, this theme is probably the most relevant theme that could have been picked for the current state of things. And I bet we could have this conversation over multiple days. You know, one afternoon is probably not enough to discuss failure. But what I love about the program for today is that it really does show that this kind of concept and topic can really be discussed by lots of different people in lots of different fields. And that failure is not necessarily just a negative thing, that it may be necessary and natural, and that there may be some impacts that are quite positive that come out of failure. And I'm sure that all presenters and the keynote speakers will show us just this. So I'm not going to talk any longer. I'm excited to be here for some of the presentations, and I hope the discussion is lively. The future of failure couldn't be more relevant. And so on behalf of the Dean, I thank you all for participating in this, and thank you, Walter, for doing such a good job in making sure we discuss topics like this. Just thank you all in advance for collaborating and being here today.
Thank you very much, Heather, and thank you very much everyone who has joined us today, and welcome. As Heather was making her remarks, and as I was reflecting myself on the subject of this conference, I once again was convinced about the ability of Walter and the Humanities Center to see the future, as well as the ability of the arts and humanities to predict the future. And what I mean is the subject of this conference came up way before the COVID pandemic, right? And here we have the pandemic. We have been living through the year of multiple failures. Failure to vaccinate, failure to respond to the pandemic, failure to coordinate, failure to vote, failure to leave the office, if you wish, right? And if we have learned anything from this year of constant failures, is that failure, like Heather just said, is not necessarily just a negative thing. That's an opportunity to learn. We also learned that, unfortunately, sometimes we don't have a choice, right? So unlike planned learning and the classroom instruction that each of us are engaged in on a day-to-day basis, when we can have a syllabus and we can reasonably stick to the schedule, more or less, following the topics that we have planned, in real life, failure is unexpected. You don't have a choice. You just face the failure, and then you either respond to the failure or you fail to respond. So I think this conference theme is extremely timely, and I'm very excited about hearing highly interdisciplinary approaches and perspectives to the subject of failure that the humanities were able to predict in some ways or anticipate the importance of that subject. So what we have today is an excellent panel of 4 different papers, 2 social science angle and 2 arts and humanities. And it is from all of these different angles that the scholars in this panel today will interpret the subject of failure, and they will show and highlight how failure is essentially a dual concept. It's negative on one end, but it's also positive, or at least it's opening room for learning and for progress. So we have scholars from political science, sociology, theater department, and English. We are on a relatively tight schedule today, so what I would suggest in terms of organizing this conference is that we allow each of the speakers to go with their 30-minute presentation. If you have questions as you're hearing these talks, please type your questions in the chat window. There will probably be time for us to unmute ourselves and ask a question, but it really depends on the number of questions. If we have too many questions, I'll just use my moderator role to sort through the questions and ask some of studies and planning, sharing some insights about his research on reframing the shrinking city. Patrick, you're welcome. Take the floor.
Okay, well, thank you. I moved our disruptor to the waiting room since I have co-host responsibilities. But if we do have additional disruptions, hopefully somebody else will take care of them because I will be distracted. So let me load my slides here. Okay, everybody see the PowerPoint? Great, so my name is Patrick Cooper McCann. I am actually, I think I was attributed to the sociology department, and there's certainly a sociological angle to my presentation today, but I'm in urban studies and planning, and I'll be presenting research under the title here, Reframing the Shrinking City. Before I kind of get into my presentation, I just want to make just a couple of quick acknowledgements. First, to my research assistant, Andrew Jason. So Andrew is a Master of Urban Planning student here at Wayne State in his second year, and he has been working with me on this project and has done a really great job, particularly in producing some of the maps that you're going to be seeing today. And I also want to thank Wayne State University, of course, the Wayne State Humanities Center, through which I received a faculty fellowship, and also OBPR, the Arts and Humanities Research Grant, which enabled me to hire Andrew. So in my talk today, it's going to have three parts. So first, I want to kind of walk you through the theory about why we have shrinking cities at all. Why would we expect, in some situations, for a community to lose population or to lose households or to lose housing? I am then going to get into the analysis and apply that theory to the city of Detroit and all of its suburbs. So I'm going to do kind of a detailed explanation about the patterns of shrinkage that we see in Metro Detroit over the past century. And then finally going to talk about some, all right, I just removed Ethan from the room. And I hope we can have some stricter moderation. Maybe there needs to be like a Q&A for each person who attempts to enter from now on. Who are you? What's your affiliation with Wayne State? Okay, onward. So in relating to the conference theme here today, the kind of key question that I'm engaging with is, what is a shrinking city? What's this concept? And what is its relation to failure? Should we regard shrinking cities as failed cities? And if so, what kind of failure do they represent? Who should be considered at fault for the patterns of decline and abandonment that we've seen? And what should we do in response? How can we create a more just and equitable metropolitan area in Detroit or elsewhere? I see someone waiting to enter the room, and I would advise being cautious about that. So this map that you see here was produced about a decade ago by a team of researchers in Germany under the Shrinking Cities Project, actually in the kind of mid-2000s. And this is a visualization of all of the cities around the world that have experienced varying degrees of population loss over the last 20 to 30 years. It's a pretty widespread phenomenon, although it varies widely in the sources of population loss, in the extent of population loss, in the severity of it. And so there's been a kind of robust debate since the introduction of this term and this attempt to draw a kind of like worldwide picture of shrinkage to try to better define the concept. And in particular, in the United States, This debate has centered on some of the kind of following issues. So fundamentally, there's been a debate over whether this term, this idea of a shrinking city, should be reserved for just those places that aren't just losing residents, but where there is evidence of decline, of housing abandonment, for example. And whether or not you think that that ought to kind of like that ought to be the subject of this research and of the kind of planning and policy and response, influences perhaps how you think we should be measuring shrinkage. Is a shrinking city one that's just losing people, regardless of the length of that or intensity of that loss? Should it be measured by something else? The number of households that are declining, changes in employment or income or property values? Is there a certain threshold of shrinkage that suggests that a city is now a shrinking city? Should we be focusing exclusively on the municipal scale? Or are there other approaches to this at the neighborhood level or the regional level? And is this actually a useful term at all? Or is it a kind of stigmatizing label and we should try to approach this in another manner? So my approach to this topic is to begin by kind of differentiating three different kinds of population laws, which can kind of overlap and intersect. So population loss kind of on its own, just through demographic change. Population loss that's driven by the literal loss of housing, fewer places to live. And population loss that's driven by a loss of household demand, fewer people interested and willing to live in a particular community. So population loss alone is a nationwide trend and indeed a global trend in developed countries. And it's a product of a simple fact that if you build out a neighborhood and there's a kind of—
I'm the biggest dick in the world. Sorry. So it is en route, but it stopped.
I moved Paul. Okay. This is the first time I've used Zoom where the link was openly shared, so I've never had to encounter this. Unfortunate pandemic era phenomena. So population loss alone is driven from the simple fact that if a neighborhood is built out and the housing units are fixed, population will fall if the number of people living in each of those units falls. And there are two long-term trends dating back in this country to the late 1700s that we have consistently smaller family sizes because we're having fewer kids and we are having fewer marriages, and those marriages happen later in life, and there are more divorces. There are also more younger people and older people living alone rather than with families, right? So all of these have contributed to a long-term trend of shrinking household sizes. And so you would expect population to fall anywhere where the housing stock has stopped growing. That's the first driver of population loss. Another possible source of population loss is as a consequence of housing loss. If there are fewer places to live and household sizes are about the same, you would expect population loss. And housing loss can occur for a number of reasons. Sometimes duplexes get converted to single family, so it goes from 2 units down to 1. Sometimes housing is converted to some other use. More often, housing can be destroyed. A certain percentage, small, but gradually over time it gets to be significant. A small percentage of housing is lost each year because of tornadoes, fires, flooding, and these kinds of kind of catastrophic events. And most significantly is removal. Housing, especially if you look back to the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, a significant amount of housing in older communities throughout the United States was removed to make way for things like interstate expressways, parking lots, larger factories, larger businesses. the transition from a society oriented around walking and public transportation to a society oriented around cars, and increasingly larger cars and multi-car households, right? That has entailed a significant loss of housing in many places. And that reduces the number of places where one could live and therefore could reduce the population. The third driver of population loss is household loss. So population would also fall if there are simply too few households willing or able to live in the housing units that are available. So if a community simply cannot attract people who have the means to afford housing, then it would also be a situation in which you would have population loss. This occurs particularly in the context of a regional housing market in which you have an excessive amount of housing relative to the number of households. So you don't see this kind of population loss very much in a place like New York or LA with a really hot housing market where there's too many people and not enough housing. But you do see this kind of housing loss significantly throughout the Rust Belt, where there's a weak economy and there's too much housing being built relative to the number of people there are to occupy it. And these vacancies in the housing market, it's not like they're randomly distributed, where every community has some vacant housing because there's too much overall. Instead, the most desirable and prosperous communities are completely occupied. And the least desirable, most stigmatized communities have a concentration of housing vacancy as a result of this region-wide dynamic of oversupply. Which neighborhoods would fall into this category? Why are neighborhoods perceived as less desirable or stigmatized? This is partially based on what you might consider to be at least somewhat objective characteristics. These are perceptions of the quality of life in a place. So if people perceive a place as having low quality housing or high rates of crime or lots of noise or lack of access to jobs or amenities, they would be less likely to live there, and that would reduce housing prices in that community. But we also know that a very significant driver of housing prices is prejudice or implicit bias. So people also make judgments, if only implicitly, of the composition of the people living in a community, kind of regardless of its condition. And we know that white households are somewhat less likely to be interested in living in communities with a higher percentage of African American, or to a lesser extent, Hispanic and Asian residents. And so you also have kind of an unfair stigmatization of neighborhoods based on their racial composition or based on their class or other characteristics. And historically, we know from the research of people like Thomas Segru and others that low-income and Black communities have received both less public investment and less private investment. Less public investment because they have lower property values, which reduces the capacity of local governments to ensure that those are objectively good communities in terms of their kind of physical and social, social service characteristics. And they have less private investment because they tend to trend toward being poorer communities, and individual households don't have the same level of resources to invest in their homes. And therefore, the communities that are most likely to suffer from that third form of population loss are these communities that are kind of unjustly stigmatized, in particular, low-income and Black communities. And so this is why we shouldn't be surprised by the kind of existence of a Rust Belt in the United States. It's sort of primed for this population loss. The macro trend of a weak economy with a lot of jobs being shifted elsewhere plays on top of these kind of other conditions. So shrinking family sizes and an overall aging population, widespread loss of houses in many communities due to things like expanded highways, expanded infrastructure, expanded industry, and an excessive housing supply due to nonstop sprawl in a relatively weak economy. And so it's not surprising in these places like Metro Detroit, Cleveland, or even Chicago, that you wouldn't see a significant amount of infill housing, but rather new housing on the edges. And that we know that there's long histories in these communities of structural racism that would, in particular, limit reinvestment in poorer and Black neighborhoods. So that's sort of the theory behind what I'm going to show you. And so now I'm going to actually kind of talk through some of these existing patterns. So my approach to this, I won't get too detailed into the methodology, but kind of rather than do a kind of shorter time period national case study of cities, I did a detailed case study of the entire metropolitan Detroit, but focused on the Tri-County area, Oakland, Wayne, and Macomb. And I went as far back in time as I could, trying to find when did each community at both the kind of municipal level and at the census tract level peak in population and household, and then track that experience of shrinkage from then to, well, not quite the present, but to 2010. And so, as I said, the indicators that I'm using for shrinkage are population and occupied households. And for the locality level, I was able to do this using census data from 1930 to 2010, 1930 being the earliest date that any community in Metro Detroit peaked in population. And then at the tract level from 1970 to 2010. The data was limited by the need to keep the geography constant. So I'm looking at the boundaries of municipalities in 2010 and the 2010 census tract boundaries. And then keeping those boundaries fixed, going backward in time, 10 years, 10 years, 10 years, 10 years, and looking at who is living and how much housing is there occupied within those exact same boundaries. And I've looked at a whole bunch of kind of other variables to make sense of this data. I'm not going to get into all of this, but looking at things like the age of the housing stock in those communities. When were they first built up? Is heavy industry present? And if so, how old are those industrial buildings? How did the Homeowners Loan Corporation assess that neighborhood in 1939? Was it redlined? What was its racial composition, household income, household size, population density? Were there group quarters present? And I also looked at aerial imagery. DTE used to do regular flyovers of the region, and through Wayne State, actually, you can access aerial imagery of Metro Detroit going back to the 1940s. So you can actually look at a place at its peak, and you can look at it over subsequent decades from above and see how its built environment changed. So what did I find? First of all, there has been nonstop population loss in the heart of Detroit, Hamtramck, and Highland Park since 1930. So this phenomenon of Detroit losing residents, if you look at a smaller scale of geography, has been continuous now for about 90 years. And there's a kind of lag between when a community peaks in population and when it peaks in occupied housing units. Because you can be losing population, but have more small individual households still growing. So there's usually about a kind of 20-year lag. And since 1950, these same communities within this initial geography have lost households every single decade, with one exception for Hamtramck, because they had a burst of immigration in the 90s. In the area of Metro Detroit in which this is occurring, in which you see population loss and occupied housing loss, has been growing every subsequent decade, from that central area to the entire city of Detroit, to many of its inner ring suburbs, and now even beyond the inner ring suburbs. And here's one of the maps that I put together using the data set that we assembled. So you can see here Highland Park and Hamtramck in 1930 reaching its population peak. Then Detroit, Royal Oak Township, Ecorse, River Rouge peaking in 1950 and kind of expanding outward from there, where more than half of all of the localities in the Tri-County area peaked in population by 1990. And while you can't see it on the map, Detroit experienced that population peak at its core at the same time as Hamtramck and Highland Park. So this is a quote pulled from a planning report written by a graduate student at U of M who went on to have a career in planning. And he said, the entire inner boulevard area, the area within Grand Boulevard, has been characterized of late years by sharp losses of population, ranging between 1925 and 1931. You know, as many as 117,000 people had left that area in this time period, most of which was prior to the onset of the Great Depression. And to help you visualize why this would have occurred or where, so this is a map showing the population density of the city of Detroit. I think it's 1934. And these neighborhoods that almost appear in black here actually are predominantly African-American neighborhoods, and others are predominantly immigrant neighborhoods, especially up closer to Highland Park. It was these extremely densely populated neighborhoods that were the first to kind of hit a peak and have come down from them since. Not coincidentally, these are also neighborhoods that were redlined by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s, meaning they were marked as being, quote, definitely declining. And population loss was one of the factors considered by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Although famously, they also, it was an explicitly racist determination in which any neighborhood seen to have an African-American population was assigned a red code. So not all redlined neighborhoods had African-American residents, but almost all African-American neighborhoods were redlined. The final map I'll show you from this time period to again kind of illustrate what's going on here. This is a map from 1939 produced by Detroit's Buildings Department, showing the location, these kind of black blurs around the edge, of every new housing unit constructed in 1939. And so it's the same phenomenon that you see today, actually. It's just that the edge of the metropolitan area is far closer in. So Detroit was still experiencing growth in 1939, but all of that growth was in the outer neighborhoods. And at the same time, the inner core was beginning to depopulate. Those population losses continued in the city of Detroit between 1940 and 1950. There was some growth again in the center due to the boom of World War II. But even during World War II, a significant fraction of Detroit, especially around its kind of the heart of its industry, was experiencing population losses. And here I've kind of just aggregated all of this data together so you can see the number of communities that reach its population peak in each year. So it goes from 2 to 6 total, to 17 total, to 51 total, to 57, right? Most of the suburbs of Metro Detroit are losing population and have been for decades. And this corresponds roughly to the median age of the housing stock, which supports that first theory as a partial explanation, that these are communities that stopped building additional housing, ran out of space, and started to lose people as family sizes decreased. You also can see that the oldest communities have experienced by far the most population loss. So the communities that peaked in 1930, for example, they only have 31% on average of their original population remaining. But this is somewhat explained by the fact that they were, vastly more densely populated than later communities. So, Hamtramck, for example, had a population density in 1930 of about 27,000 people per square mile. Hamtramck is still the most densely populated community in all of Michigan, but today it's only around 13,000. So in a way, they had more significant population loss because they had more people to lose in the transition from an intensely walkable, transit-oriented kind of development pattern to one that was instead focused around the car. Here you see the figures for peak occupied housing. So there's sort of a 20+ year lag in most communities between when they peaked in population and when they stopped adding housing units. But it's a similar kind of set of cities. So, Hamtramck, Highland Park, River Rouge are first in 1950, followed by some additional communities in 1960, kind of moving into the oldest parts of the region. So like Southeast Oakland County, the Grosse Pointes even, and especially downriver. So some of those communities that have not added housing stock since 1970 on net would include Berkeley, Ecorse, Ferndale, Huntington Woods, Pleasant Ridge, Wyandotte. And notably these, so the stereotype of the shrinking city is a city that is experiencing extreme poverty. But many of these cities that have experienced nonstop housing loss are cities that are actually quite prosperous, like Pleasant Ridge or Huntington Woods. Here are the kind of aggregated statistics looking at the peak household data. And again, you see this big difference between the communities that peaked very early, 1950, 1960, which have lost 50% of all the housing units they once had. Highland Park is the most extreme. Highland Park has lost 80% nearly of the housing units that it had at its peak in 1930. And these were communities typically that were redlined. So the communities that have experienced the least population loss have generally got a higher rating. And the communities that are still growing weren't rated at all because they didn't exist. They were farmland. The parts of Metro Detroit that are actively gaining population today and gaining housing units almost universally were communities where there was no residential development in 1930. This is a map showing the average age of housing stock in all of these communities in the Tri-County area. And this is a pretty good indicator of where communities have experienced population loss over decades. But it's not a good indicator of where that extreme housing loss has occurred, right? Places like Grosse Pointe Park, Grosse Pointe, Pleasant Ridge, they have old historic housing stock. They haven't experienced decline. A more kind of suggestive indicator of where decline is concentrated. So I took the samples of localities and I looked at them by their racial demographics. So there are 15 localities that have a higher than typical percentage of African American residents. There's 103 that are kind of whiter than typical compared to the region. And if you look at those, 14 out of 15 cities that are disproportionately African American are losing population, almost all of them. And they've lost a significant share of their peak population. And African Americans in Metro Detroit are living in housing stock that is on average about 13 years older. Communities that are disproportionately white, very different, very different statistics, relatively few are losing population and they haven't lost very much. Looking at a finer scale at the kind of census tract level, the most severe housing loss is clearly associated with the expansion of industry, the expansion of major infrastructure, and most significantly racialized poverty. Whereas some of these older, more prosperous residential suburbs, they've had small scale housing and population loss, but without experiencing decline. So just to show you this really quickly in the few minutes I have left, this is looking kind of closer at the census tract level. Every community in red on this map has less housing in 2010 than it did in 1970. So again, the phenomenon of shrinking cities is very widespread and goes into many of Detroit's suburbs. This is also fairly enduring. So this data is only for 1970 forward, but this map shows you the continuous or intermittent decline from each decade. So most of Detroit, for example, has been losing population since 1970. Housing since 1970 forward. And many of them, these census tracts would have been losing it for several decades prior. But in terms of severe occupied housing loss, right, where is this really manifesting in decline? These communities in dark red have lost more than 50% of all of their occupied housing. And here you start to see a distinction between the sources of this problem, because in the suburbs, there are very clear causes of some of these zones. Selfridge Air Force Base, the industrial corridor between Mound and Van Dyke, the industrial heart of Auburn Hills, the industrial corridor in Livonia along I-96, Metro Airport. Whereas in the city of Detroit, it's a combination of this same sort of infrastructure industry problem, but also racialized poverty and stigmatization. So last map I'm going to show you, this is data I'm still analyzing, but this is the location of all the manufacturing buildings in Metro Detroit in 1970, which corresponds pretty well with subsequent patterns of more extreme housing loss. So let me just conclude quickly and kind of circle back to my initial question. So what kind of failure is urban shrinkage? I think it's a regional failure. I don't think it's a problem affecting the central cities alone. I don't think there's anything unique about Detroit in this respect. And in fact, a majority of cities losing population and even households are clearly suburban communities, not just the central city. However, the severity of decline varies a lot. And I think that's best explained by these patterns of deindustrialization in the region and by racist housing practices, racist infrastructure building practices. And we need to develop planning policies that would address not just how to kind of adapt to the situation, but to stop needless abandonment from occurring. And so, my recommendations, these are kind of high level. We could have a discussion later about more detailed policy, but we need to stop excess housing construction on the metropolitan fringe and redirect more investment into older housing in older communities. We need to fairly fund these older governments and older school districts. We need to help the low-income families living in isolated poverty and invest in education, jobs, and wages. We need to be conscious about the ramifications for housing of how we expand and build industry and heavy infrastructure. And we need to address racism and the spatial stigmatization of neighborhoods to prevent their kind of unnecessary and extreme decline. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for sharing this amazing research with us and being right on time. Thanks a lot. So there are a couple of questions to you, but we are going to keep all of these questions to the end. So just as a reminder, if you have any additional questions to Patrick, please put them in the chat window and I'm going to collect them. And now it's my pleasure to welcome my colleague, Christian Taylor from the Political Science Department, who'll talk about her lessons learned by looking at the natural disasters and infrastructure failures. Christian, welcome.
Thank you, Elisa, and thanks to Walter and the Humanities Center for organizing this conference, and thanks for the advisory board for giving research support to this idea of failure and thinking about failure as lots of different things. So to build on what we've talked about before, let me share my screen. I have some slides for today. Let's see, there we go. So I'm a political scientist and I'm really interested in the politics of disasters. And much of my work is in this area of policy failure and learning. And my motivation for the research for today is to examine why some policy failures lead to learning and policy change and some don't. And the central premise or operating theory that I have in my research is that some policy failures can lead to learning, but they may not necessarily lead to change because of the type of learning that occurred after the disaster. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we work through as we were through the presentation and some of the data that I've got. And then really out of today's talk, I want to look at the findings on the types of policy learning that occur after disaster. I think that that is the real kernel of knowledge that's important for thinking about how we transition from failure to learning and ultimately change and hopefully policy improvement. This is just kind of a theoretical a very simple theoretical framework for what I'm looking at. You have the disaster, you have an occurrence. It could be a hurricane, it could be a huge disruption to drinking water infrastructure, it could be a dam failure, it could be a bridge collapse. And as a result, and as a result, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going in the wrong direction here. As a result, this failure in a policy that we have to keep people and property safe in a crisis is revealed, right? We have a policy didn't work the way that it was intended, the way it was designed to work. And so failure really reveals flaws in how policies are formulated, how they're implemented. And what happens is this opportunity for policy learning. And this could be learning, we think of this as learning in government organizations about different policy tools, about different policy instruments that they can use to produce a better outcome, learning about the underlying causes of the problem, or learning about governmental processes. So this is really the theory of action that I have that underpins this research. So from a public policy, political science standpoint, what do we think of when we think about policy failure? For anyone who is a positivist or a post-positivist, this idea of what's a failure and what's a success are very subjective terms. There could be claims of failure that are politically oriented and politically motivated, but usually we think that when we call a policy a failed policy, we think that there are a few different causes, that the goal wasn't achieved. So imagine if we had the Affordable Care Act and we weren't able to provide health insurance to people who had pre-existing conditions previously, right? That we would consider that to be a goal that is not achieved. If there's a negative impact, so to build on Patrick's talk earlier, a lot of the urban renewal programs that came out of the 1970s were viewed to have this negative impact on Rust Belt cities because of how transportation was designed and public housing was constructed. And then there are failures to act. And those are a classic example is what we have just experienced at the start of this pandemic. And that was the failure of government to really act and put policies in place to address and shore up the spread of the COVID-19 virus. And then other claims of failure are associated with opposition from key groups. And there's a bit of discourse that in public policy now about gun control. So those are where we see claims of failure, and what the literature says that there are claims of failure. But we think that like the typology of policy failures as they occur would be failure to achieve its goals, failure of how the policy was formulated, or failure of politics to address the problem. As someone who studies natural disasters, that's my wheelhouse. I think of policy failure as an opportunity. Generally, we think that policy failures are opportunities to improve government performance. When policies fail, we have the chance to revise flawed programs. We have the chance to address community problems that were previously unknown. And so in the context of natural disasters, like the big so what of this for me is that when policies that we have in place to ensure that people and property are kept out of floodways and protected from storm surge and high wind from a hurricane or a tornado, in the context of disasters, when we see that the policies around those mitigating the effects of those pieces of disaster, when they don't work, it sheds light on people's vulnerability to hazards. And what's more important is the pockets of social vulnerability that exist in a community. So when policies fail, they shed light on social vulnerability, and it gives government the opportunity to address that. And it also gives government the opportunity to promote and enhance resilience. So whether it's the series of water mains that run down Jefferson Avenue here in Detroit that fail and break and are repaired over and over and over again, and DWSD has to go through the process of addressing all of those sinkholes that pop up on Jefferson and all of the infrastructure failures that are happening below ground as the water comes in to the treatment plant and gets treated and pumped out. When failures happen in the infrastructure system, it gives local government the opportunity to promote and enhance resilience. So if a water main fails, or if the distribution system of our water systems fail, we can learn, or have the opportunity to learn in a way that promotes and enhances resilience, and it lessens the impact on people and communities. The critical piece of this is learning. So we can have, like I tell my son, you can take a test, but if you don't demonstrate what you have learned, you wouldn't have done what your job is. And so when we think about policy failures that are revealed by disasters, whether it's a natural disaster or a technological disaster like infrastructure failure, what you do with that failure is critical. And hopefully, most government organizations will want to learn. I started out this strain of research thinking that most of the people in public organizations were not necessarily concerned with improving policy, and that was a very naive assumption in my mind. I thought that they were more concerned with economic development than they were with protecting their communities. But what I have learned over time has really bolstered my view of people who work in government and who work to mitigate the effects of a hurricane or of infrastructure that crumbles and fails over time, is that they want people to be safe. They want people to have clean drinking water. And so this learning is really an important piece of this research. So just a bit of an overview of what the literature says. Policy learning is the process by which individuals and government seek out new information to address a policy problem and consider that information, take it into account, and then make changes in light of what they've learned. We think that there are 4 kinds of policy learning. That's social learning, or thick loop learning. It's also called double loop learning. And this is the rarest kind of policy learning that happens. This is learning about the underlying causes of what the failure revealed. And there's instrumental learning, thin learning about tools and instruments that government agencies can use to address a problem. Governmental learning, so learning about administrative processes and procedures. And political learning about political strategies and tactics to overcome opposition. So that's the typology that I use for policy learning. I'm going to talk about 2 cases that have been ongoing research projects. The first is a natural disaster, and that's Hurricane Harvey. Hurricane Harvey was a hurricane that struck the Houston metro area, Texas Gulf Coast, and coastal Bend regions in 2018. It made landfall in Rockport, Texas. It was a Category 4 storm. It impacted 32 counties in southeastern Texas. What's interesting and notable about Hurricane Harvey is that the damage and the impact of the storm was so widespread, and that because it was so widespread, it impacted cities. It impacted the city of Houston, and it also impacted the it also impacted all of these rural communities, particularly counties with large chunks of unincorporated areas where people didn't have like a city government to go to. So that's our first case. And the other case that I'm looking at, trying to compare failure in learning in two different types of disasters. And these are technological disasters or infrastructure, water infrastructure and public health. And what's interesting and notable about technological disasters around water and health is that they are utterly interdependent. Our public health is inextricably linked to having clean drinking water. And so, so I did a series of case studies in Toledo, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, Robeson County, North Carolina, Lumberton, North Carolina, Red Springs, North Carolina, and Durham. And really spent a lot of time talking to drinking water system operators and managers, city managers, and public health officials about different events and disruptions that happened in their water systems, from large scale ones like the toxic algae bloom in Toledo, to facing the challenge of decaying and declining infrastructure in the city of Detroit, to PFAS contamination and Gen X contamination in Robeson County, North Carolina. So we had several different types of disruptions and events that emerged out of this series of case studies, and trying to assess what a policy failure looked like in those circumstances and what types of learning would occur afterwards. So we sort of have two different sets of government officials, right? Emergency managers, land use planners, hazard mitigation folks, and then drinking water system managers, operators, and public health folks. So two different epistemic communities, if you will. I used a mixed methodology, and I'm really, to be frank, like I'm still in the process of analyzing all of this data. So this is really a statement on where things are today in terms of this research. So for Harvey, I did 15 open-ended interviews with 22 local government officials across 8 counties, 6 cities impacted by Hurricane Harvey. And then the technological disaster consisted of semi-structured interviews with 15 officials in drinking water systems and public health in 5 cities and 1 county. We had an interview protocol that asked the same questions for both types of disasters, about disasters and crises, policy learning, and policy change. With an army of graduate students, we transcribed and did content analysis of all of the interviews, developed a code book, operationalized definitions about what disasters are, policy failure, types of learning, and some types of policy outcomes. And then we fed the transcripts through this amazing qualitative data analysis software called QDA Miner, and did our content analysis using that. And if anyone ever wants to talk about QDA Miner, I'm happy to do so and help introduce you to that method, that tool to analyze qualitative data. And then very recently, along with some colleagues in communications and social work and engineering here at Wayne State, we have run a survey of drinking water utility operators. It's a national survey of drinking water utility operators across the United States. And we asked them all kinds of questions about coordination, communication. We asked them about policy learning. We asked about policy failure. We asked about policy change in response to a crisis. And so this is the data that really drives the study. And so I would be more than happy at a political science conference to put up like a big logistic regression model. But for you all, I figured that no one really wants to see a big table of data on a Friday afternoon. So I ran a logistic regression model to look for to assess the presence and absence of learning after Hurricane Harvey. And so what I found was that policy learning is associated with communities that have a large population. And the policy learning, so taking on information, considering it and changing policy, it tends to be associated with communities that have a relatively larger percentage of the population that's African American. It is also associated with communities that are cities and not counties. And policy learning is associated with communities that have prior disaster experience. So we know a few things. Big cities with a relatively larger proportion of the population that's African American that have prior disaster experience have a greater likelihood of learning after a disaster than those that aren't. So that's how we're linking failure. So the disaster reveals failure to learning and community characteristics. When we think about linking failure and learning after a technological disaster, specifically drinking water infrastructure failures, we find that learning is associated in drinking water systems that use surface water as their source, so as opposed to groundwater, and that learning is associated with drinking water systems that purchase their water from a wholesaler. And what we really expected to find that drinking water systems that had low levels of water quality violations would be associated with policy learning, and we found the opposite. So the more water quality violations that a drinking water system has, the greater the likelihood that they'll learn after a disaster. And then poverty seems to be a big indicator. So learning is more likely to occur in communities that have, or water systems that have a large proportion of their population, their service population, that's living at or below the poverty line. And this is like the head scratcher of all of our findings. Because I'm a political scientist, I have to ask about partisanship, and I wonder how party and ideology play a role. And so we found that for drinking water systems that are resided in states that have unified political control over the legislature and governor's office, that those systems are more likely to learn after a disaster. And like doubly so if there's a Republican governor and a Republican majority in the state house. So this is like a total head scratcher for me and my team. My interpretation of this and why it is because the state regulatory body that oversees drinking water systems, each state has one, whether it's situated or resided in a public health department or a public works department or environmental management and resource management department. Those primacy agencies that govern and regulate drinking water systems, if there's a Republican in place, that seems to be an influential piece. So we've got to dig into that finding a little bit more. I'm not entirely sure what that means. But in terms of policy learning by type, I have a bit of a divergence here. So the results and the frequencies from the qualitative interviews are really, really consistent with what the theory says. That instrumental learning, that thin learning about tools and tactics and strategies that already exist to manage problems. So like small incremental changes, that those should be the most frequent. And for both natural disasters and technological disasters, they are. 52% of all the learning that happens after a natural disaster in our study was instrumental learning, more than half. 43% of the learning that took place after technological disasters in our study was instrumental learning. So learning about tools, learning about policy tools to address certain problems. Political learning, this was like the surprising piece of this. Much of the literature on policy learning says that that learning about strategies and tactics is really about how to control the politics of the situation. is one that we would expect, but is sort of unimportant. So it occurs, but it's not as important as instrumental learning or social learning. And really what we found was that the political learning was much more important than what the theory indicates. So it wasn't just like a procedural sort of how to make the sausage kind of politics, but to give you an example from the interviews, for political learning in the after Hurricane Harvey, there was a municipality that had a scale model of their city built. And they had it built in this plexiglass box, and they could simulate flooding and storm surge with it. And what they would do is take it out to different community groups and get the community groups on board with changes to the building code and changes to land use planning, that discussions that were going on in the city. And those community groups in turn pressed city council to adopt code plus flood mitigation practices when the city council was really reluctant to do so. So that was like an interesting pivot of the city council, or of the emergency management and hazard mitigation department, to really use that strategy and take it to the public to press city council to make a change that they didn't want to make. And in terms of technological disasters, the political learning with drinking water systems really will come as a shock to none of the people in this session, that the political learning was mostly about communicating with elected officials and the public. And that these drinking water system operators and managers really had to take steps to reach out and communicate what was going on to the public in ways that they hadn't before. So that's a pretty interesting finding. So these frequencies about type of policy learning are really, really consistent with the theory, although political learning, we sort of learn a bit more about the relative importance of that. In the survey data, in the quantitative data, where we had asked drinking water system managers to self-report about learning by type among these drinking water systems operators, we had a very different result. And so that we gave them lots of options and sort of operationalized what social learning was and what governmental learning was. Really practical questions. Did you learn about new risks? Did you use new tools to address this problem? And what we found was that pretty much across the board, like, they self-reported learning in equally. There's a slight bit more of instrumental learning, but not to the extent to which not the extent to which we would expect from what the literature says. So that's sort of an area that warrants some deeper digging and future investigation. I want to be cognizant of the time as I wrap up here. So when we think about variation in learning by type of disaster, all types of learning are consistent with what the theory indicates. Social learning is infrequent, but not when self-reported, which is something that that needs to be sussed out a little bit. Instrumental learning is very common. And then, as I mentioned before, that political learning seems to be more important than what we initially anticipated. And when we compare failure in learning in natural and technological disasters, for natural disasters, recent disasters are important, and the experience of a disaster matters. And so does the type of municipality. Cities matter. Cities mean that you are more likely to be in a place where your government organizations learn. And we think that there are some potential explanations for this, right? The experience, right? Knowing the nature of the problem, experiencing a hurricane over and over and over again is going to send you a signal that something's wrong and you need to address it in your community. Capacity, so governing capacity, organizational capacity, and professionalism. This was something that we didn't quantify in the study, didn't really ask about, but I suspect that professional training and being highly qualified in your position has a lot to do with having this sort of learning-oriented approach to governance. And then in technological disasters, we saw more political learning than natural disasters. And I would suspect that, or my interpretation of this is that there's more political learning to do in these types of drinking water infrastructure systems than there is in an emergency management or hazard mitigation or planning office, because they're mostly closed off, highly technical systems. And the political science literature calls these policies without publics. So policies that are governed by technical experts and relatively closed off from the rest of from the public, and they're not really involved in a lot of the day-to-day decision making, and there aren't a lot of organized coalitions around that particular public good or service. But given in light of what's happened in Flint, and given what's happened with water shutoffs since 2014 in the city of Detroit, we now have an increasingly engaged public around drinking water and drinking water infrastructure. And as a result, my interpretation of this is that these water systems have to be much more public facing than they have in the past, and that this isn't just a policy domain that's governed by technocrats. So just to wrap up, some areas for future research. I find support for the connection between failure and learning in natural disasters, and in drinking water infrastructure systems. And there's support for this idea, one that I need to do some more teasing out on, and that like most of the failures in technological disaster and for drinking water systems is that there aren't these big steps towards there aren't these big events that bowl over everything, right? There aren't these big events that press water infrastructure systems to make significant changes, but there are these events, there are these failures that send a pulse. There are little problems going on that we need to address. We need to fix this deferred maintenance problem in our distribution system. Pump failure, pump failure, pump failure. Like, so it sends little pulses. So, future research is going to look at the nature of these pulse events that send a signal that there's a problem in the system versus a press event that pushes policy change forward. We have, I think the big contribution from this research is that there are more opportunities for learning in technocratic organizations like drinking water infrastructure systems. And then ultimately the next step is, how do we understand the difference between learning and change? So that's sort of how I'm going to wrap up today. I'd like to thank the Humanities Center for the fellowship and the support of this research. This is research that's also funded by the National Science Foundation, but I really, really appreciate the Humanities Center and the opportunity to think about these two types of disasters and types of failures in a way that is more comparative and not just a stovepiped approach. So I really want to thank the Humanities Center for that. And I look forward to everyone's questions at the end of the session.
Thank you so much, Christian, for sharing this groundbreaking research with us and being on time likewise. And thank you very much, everyone who have contributed questions to the chat. As a reminder,